All right, here we go. Um, Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Do the Work Town Hall series. My name is Ari Davachi. I am the programming director here at Do the Work. Been with this organization for almost 4 years, which is wild. For those of you who may not know what Do the Work is, we're a organization that's all across the country, based in creating sustainable and meaningful change for queer people in marketing and advertising, which really means representation both inside of the marketing and ad industry and then outside as well in the kind of work that we make. And this is really the backbone of my work is having these conversations with folks that you're about to meet and hear from, who are industry leaders, thought leaders, and also just people who care about this kind of work, who see the value in this kind of work, and understand that what we're doing at Do the Work is not an ego trip of any sort, but rather like what needs to happen based on their experiences in the industry. And so I'm not going to waste any more time talking about myself. I want to introduce them to you, or rather let them introduce themselves. Keisha, I'm going to come to you first. Can you tell the folks who you are, what you do, where you are, and just a bit about why you do the work that you do?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Keisha Townsend Taitt, as you can see there, and I am an ally to the community and really happy to be a part of today's conversation. So thank you for having me. I currently serve as the Chief Inclusion Officer at GSD&M, which is a full service agency based in Austin, Texas. So that is where I'm calling in from tonight. For the work that I do, it's really about inclusion for the workforce, but also for our product and the work. And I hashtag do the work that we're talking about right now, because I've always been of the mindset that like, if you don't like something, do something about it. And I think that's a really important mindset that more people should have.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to speak with you and to hear from you. Josh, I want to come to you next. Can you tell the
Yeah,
folks where you are, what you do, why you do it?
for sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Weaver. I'm currently based in Houston, so not too far from Keisha. I'm currently at the Ad Council serving as campaign director on the Love Has No Labels LGBTQ plus anti-discrimination initiative. We actually launched last month our PSA on GMA, but hopefully you see it out in the world and just really grateful for that. Most priorly, I was the VP of marketing at the Trevor Project, where I was able to lead that marketing team towards success in terms of driving awareness for those critical services of text, chat, and phone suicide prevention for LGBTQ plus youth. And the reason why I do what I do is because I started out in the private sector. I formerly was at Vice, but I really thought and really hard and long about being able to kind of leave a legacy of impact, and ultimately use what time I have on earth for good. And I've gone through certain experiences in life that I want, people who step in my footsteps have to avoid and to have a better experience. So being able to lend myself my expertise towards the betterment of my community, including especially LGBTQ plus people and BIPOC people, is just a really critical component, and I'm grateful to be able to do so.
We're grateful that you're here. Thank you for introducing yourself. Again, can't wait to hear you speak today. Finally, last but not least, Lisa Balser, can you tell the folks where you're at, what you do, why you do it, please?
Sure, thank you. I'm excited to be here in conversation and community. So my name is Lisa Balser, and my pronouns are she, her. My background is as a GCD and ECD copywriter. I'm also a certified diversity executive, and I founded New and Improved, and we are a change agency on a mission to change agencies with a new approach to DE&I, which is what we're here to talk about. I will say why I do what I do, much like what Keisha and Josh kind of said, I'm like also kind of intersecting there. So my lived experience, even with the privilege that I have as a white woman, I literally have been diagnosed with PTSD from work. And I don't want anybody ever to go through anything even remotely like what I did, let alone what I saw my colleagues going through who had different intersecting identities. We just got to do better. The world has to do better, and the industry absolutely has to do better across the workforce, the workplace, and the work that we create. And I know we're going to talk more about that. I'm currently in Atlanta. I don't know if I said that. And like I said, happy to be here and have this conversation.
Awesome. Okay, now let's talk about what we're here to talk about, which is inclusion versus the idea of a cultural fit. And I can speak to this from both angles, I think, just from just a little bit of table setting. From my personal lived experience, my first agency job, I was the only like very out queer person, gay person, I should say, and I was also the only Middle Eastern person. So inclusion was an interesting concept. I was like, I'm here, so I'm included, but am I like, is this inclusion? And then throughout my career at that agency and other places as well, I became a hiring manager and a person who was managing other folks. And there were multiple moments in which I gave feedback to the HR folks that I didn't think it was a cultural fit. And at the time, I didn't really see the dangers of that. And I think a lot of people still don't see the dangers in that. I think for me personally, it just frankly made a lot of assumptions, in my personal opinion, about who that person was. Like I woke up this morning and I'm a very gay person, but like I put on this football t-shirt and like I was sat down with y'all and I was like, wait, like this is literally what we're talking about. I was like, people have complexity. Like, what do you mean cultural fit? How is that helping anyone? What is that idea, the concept? And so I want to start by asking you, Lisa, if you could tell us a bit about where you think this term came from and why in Adland specifically, I should say, and why you think it's become such a mainstay, because I don't think this term has gone away, really.
It's definitely not gone away. So I feel like I agree with everything you said. I think the reason, so culture fit to me is coded language for exclusion. That's not how that's not how you meant it when you shared your story, and that's not how we have meant to mean it, but that is what it is becoming and what the reality is or has become. So to me, the idea of culture add, right, which is really something that benefits and includes everybody. And I mean, I think we've all been guilty of that, like what you said, Ari, like when I was in the agency and I'm interviewing or looking at a book, you're like, well, does that person feel like they're going to fit in our culture? Well, again, what does that mean? Does that mean you don't think they're fun enough to hang out with for a beer? Does that mean that like their work is not additive? Like what are we, and I'm a creative, so I'm speaking kind of with that lens. What are we looking at? And the more diverse the people are and the more diverse that the ideas are, right? Literally, the better the work is. There's all kinds of studies that prove this, like innovation is better, the work is better. And so I think the fact that where it comes from, kind of that human nature, unconscious bias, right? We all have it, we're all guilty of it. And we have affinity bias, which means if the work, again, speaking from a creative point, if I like funny work and I look at a book that's funny, I'm gonna probably like that book over one that doesn't have a lot of humor in it. That's just how it is. Now there's a difference between, oh, what does the account need that I'm hiring for? Like what is the tone and whatever, and how can this person do that work? And it's another of like, well, I just like that stuff. So I think we have to just check ourselves for those biases.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I'm like checking yourself for bias is for a lot of people so much easier said than done. I want to just like really challenging for a lot of people. I think I want to come to you next, Josh, because I wonder how you imagine this phrase specifically impacts LGBTQ folks.
Yeah, well, I think that in a lot of ways, there is this, first and foremost, when we say cultural fit, I think that we are connoting or implying that there is a dominant culture. There's a culture that we need to be relying on or abiding by. And I think that can be really difficult for somebody who is within the LGBTQ plus community, or sees themselves as queer, and in as much as it puts the onus on you to maybe potentially cover. And what I mean by covering is hiding intrinsic parts of yourself, hiding aspects of your experience so that you can self-preserve and ultimately get a job. I look at things such as pronouns and the hyper-politicization of pronouns. The ability to really be able to express your authentic self and your authentic gender is so critically important. And during my time at the Trevor Project, we did research detailing the import of being able to be affirmed in both pronouns and gender. But in a lot of ways, I've heard feedback from people who say that is really, for lack of better phrasing, a nail in the coffin on their resume if they include them. So in so many ways, it's this give and take between a society that's opening up but at the same time, really making it a lot harder. And when we do put onuses like this idea of cultural fit on potential employees, potential colleagues, it makes it harder, as Lisa was saying, to find people who are going to come with differing philosophies and are ultimately going to benefit and better the work. And so it's not just a matter of affirming LGBTQ plus people, which it absolutely is, but doubling down on it, it's a business advantage as well.
Well, actually, this is something I was thinking about, like as Lisa was talking, and I was like, oh my God. I also wonder if it's a bit of like when we talk about culture fit, particularly around LGBTQ folks and other folks as well, like culture fit meaning that like you may not actually question the systems that are in place here. You're actually going to fall squarely into the system. And what made me think about that was bathrooms. I have yet to work at a place that has a all gender restroom. I have like yet to work at a place like that, which is absolutely bonkers. But I wonder if like there is a bit of like, I also know that I'm the type of person who will absolutely shout from the rooftops, we need an all gender restroom. And I wonder if when we talk about cultural fit, there's a bit of like, oh, but you'll just fall, for lack of a better word, fall into line here. And you're not going to question these realities. Lisa, I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, it's the default, like Josh was saying, right? It's like this dominant culture, which absolutely still exists. I mean, we can pretend it doesn't, but we should not pretend that it doesn't, because it does. And it's the default, and the default is male, Caucasian, binary. I mean, like all of those things, right? And I think that that is something that if we're in multiple, I don't like the term dominant groups, but right, for lack of a better term right now, I'll say that we are not thinking of others' experiences, right? And so, I mean, again, we need to be conscious of doing that. Is much easier said than done, like you said, Aria, but like that's what it takes. And it takes people not only of differing communities, meaning that, the person who's not of the majority to come in and talk about it, but those in the dominant groups need to talk about it. Like, I feel like I'm going to talk about the things that I know, because I do hold privilege. I have honor and privilege. So it's up to me to like bring that to light and not relying only on, like, I'm not LGBT plus, right? But that doesn't mean that I can't ally and advocate, when I see something. And I think that's also really important, and people sometimes shy away from that, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. Keisha, I want to come to you. I want obviously thoughts on this generally, but I would love to hear from you in terms of how you feel like this is impacting the idea of DEI.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, just to build on what you said, Aria, I'm fortunate to work at a place like GSD&M where we do have a gender neutral bathroom. But like what Lisa was saying and Josh was saying about a dominant culture, I think, I mean, again, the people in power are usually from the dominant culture. But I also have learned that sometimes, like, we all have our blind spots because we all have this lens for which we view life. And sometimes it's all the more reason why you need kind of the culture ads in your agency, your place of business, because that is where, Aria, you were saying, you would scream from the rooftop if you were in an organization that didn't have a gender neutral bathroom. That's how you learn. That's how you get better. That's how policies change to become more inclusive. And I think, what they talked about is like, hiring for fit is I mean, one of the most widespread exclusionary practices. It is still alive and well, as Lisa said. And it is the opposite of inclusion and the DE&I work that I do, because it means that you are looking to hire somebody that you already know. A lot of times we look to hire people like us because that is what we feel we are most comfortable with. But when we work for an industry that is supposed to resonate and change the beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors of a very diverse country, right? And in most cases, these marginalized, diverse communities are the biggest growth opportunities. How can you make work that resonates with them? Or, you have maybe one on a team of 20, so they aren't necessarily always heard. So I feel like even though, and we've all kind of agreed that there have been times where we have used the word fit, or maybe even we're evaluating people because we are part of the process in hiring, and may have had the purest of intentions, you are essentially predisposing your agency to a legacy of homogenous teams, which is the thing that we have been trying to change for so long, and the thing that people like me in this work of DE&I are trying to do, and also groupthink. I think essentially you're sending the message that you prioritize, or your agency prioritizes conformity over creativity and innovation. So I think, for our industry in particular, that just leads to work that's not as good, work that won't resonate with as many people because it hasn't been pressure tested by people with different lenses.
If I can kind of add something to that, you had such a good point, many good points, but you made me just flashback to, I was at an agency and we were interviewing, and I had a peer, right? So we were like creative director, hiring level, interview somebody and say, I don't think that they'll be comfortable here. Right. And that was the culture fit thing. And what really he meant was he wouldn't be comfortable managing that person. He didn't know that. That was absolutely not conscious on his part, but that was what he said. I don't think that this person will be comfortable working here. And I was a little like, can we unpack that and can we have that conversation, which is hard to do. It is hard to do. And I'm also not HR, right? And not everything should go to HR. But if we have these conversations like we're having today, hopefully like all of us can be thinking of those things, even if regardless of our position in the ad world.
Before we pivot, I think, to talking about how this impacts candidates and folks who are moving into the market, I want to just ask, Keisha, how do you talk about this with your coworkers when they use that term or phrase? Like,
Yeah.
how do we have these conversations without, the usual issues that come around with these kinds of conversations?
Yeah, I think calling in versus calling out is a critical piece. And I think also in general, like words matter, but also acknowledging that language evolves. So again, fit was a very prominent practice, and in some ways was a better practice than what was there before for hiring. It was actually a more inclusive way to get people, if you could believe it or not. But today it's different, and just like, certain terms or phrases. So I think for me, Arya, to answer your question and how I have this conversation, it's sometimes like being really specific with language, offering people a bit of a refit frame. I mean, Lisa mentioned it in her first response of like, instead of culture fit, why don't we think about a culture or a team ad? Like, what is this person bringing? Also, making sure that people are really clear on why and what the process and policies and requirements are for hiring people. So we at GSD&M have a bit of a hiring interview guide. And I think by setting policies and giving people resources and language to use and frameworks to use, I think is also something that's really critical to helping have and navigate the conversation. Because let's be honest, like, we all have blind spots, and there are all potential landmines that we can step on, even DE&I leaders. And I'm sure Lisa would agree. We don't know everything. And so when you come to a conversation with a bit of grace and really trying to help somebody understand a different perspective, I in turn tend to get a lot of positive feedback from that, because again, it's not shaming someone. It's different from saying, oh my gosh, you're racist, you're sexist, you're homophobic. Like, labeling people is I mean, pro tip, do not label anyone and expect to be heard. Hopefully we all know that, but again, there are ways to have a very similar conversation and give them tools, resources, and language to where they feel more comfortable, because a lot of times it's just, listen, I'd rather stay in my comfort zone, and this feels so different to me, and I don't want to do. People are so afraid to do the wrong thing, these days. And I think sometimes you've got to open up the door, just like you did with this conversation, already saying, look, I use the word fit. Like, we're talking about it as a bad word today, but we are all guilty of using it, as we've said. And sometimes that gives people the freedom or relaxes them to be less defensive when you do have these tough conversations.
Thank you for that. Thank you for making me feel better about having done the hindsight wrong thing. Josh, do you have anything you want to add to this before we sort of pivot to from the queer perspective?
All I'll say is that, just echoing Keisha, we all have been there. I had the pleasure and privilege of working at Vice for about 4 years, but I also had the umbrage of dealing with a boys club for so many, for all intents and purposes. And I saw that play out in real time. But I've also seen different dynamics, for instance, at the Trevor Project, where it was all about affirmation and inclusion. So yeah, I think just so well put, but yeah.
So I want to ask you, I mean, you actually kind of touched upon this when you were discussing something earlier around sort of how this impacts LGBTQ people who are actually looking for work and the way that we as queer people show up for interviews, for how we write any sort of cover letters, resumes. Can you talk a bit more about the impact and like maybe even the unforeseen impact of what it's doing to the community, knowing that like we are striving for, to not be labeled as a bad culture fit?
Yeah, so I think when we have this idea of culture fit and when it permeates in so many ways, there are preconceived notions about certain organizations and how to get in and what you need to vie for. And, I think a lot of times you're sort of predicating a lot on what you think and how you want to be perceived, for lack of better phrasing. And when you go through that, when you look at things through that lens and you look at work through that lens, it really goes back to the concept of covering and the facet of having to essentially not come to work as your full self, not come as a candidate as your full self. And that's robbing both the individual from being able to be affirmed, and that has deleterious impacts on people's health, their mental health, their physical health, their risk of suicidality, their risk of violent crime. All these things are impacted by whether or not they can be affirmed and have protective spaces. And when you spend 40 plus hours a week in or around people, it has to be an environment that affirms everyone. And so one of the things that Keisha kind of touched on that I think is just really important is really the concept of empathy. And I think that a lot of what I've seen work really well in places that have been at odds and have had to try to figure out a better way to be more inclusive for a variety of different folks is really look towards teaching empathy and teaching the humanness of what it means to come to work as just a human, and not to dispense with the uniqueness of our lived experiences. I think that that's very valuable and super important. But at the same time, I think there's something to be said about being able to really see people for their whole selves. Something that's not really, we usually see people as a function of their job on a normal day. And I think that that can be a balm or an antidote to a lot of this. Well, let's talk about cultural fit. When the reality is we want to embrace and nurture the variety of people. And I also will say, just to kind of bring it back to the surface, is that it really creates an instance where you kind of feel from the LGBTQ plus perspective that there is a palpable way of being queer and a not so palpable way of being queer. And so you'll dim your shine, and you might even, feel that you're coming to work as at least part of yourself. So you're doing some justice there, and you might not see the injustice of it all. So I think in a lot of ways, creating environments, and one thing that I think can be really helpful in the ad industry as we're looking at hiring, for instance, is creating environments where you're being really proactive about telling the candidate about the experience that they'll have, making sure that the candidate experience reflects the internal experience as it pertains to the affirmation of LGBTQIA plus people, especially as it pertains to how you affirm trans and non-binary folk and using proper pronouns. All that stuff can be baked into a process to make something much more affirming for the applicant, and ultimately can really just create a great example for when they, join the team.
Can I ask a follow-up? And I'm actually going to ask this to everyone because I'm with you on the like, let's set the stage during the interview process of what this is going to be like. But also, we all work in Adland. There are places that are still figuring it out. It's not all set. It's not figured out. And that can be very scary for a interviewer, for someone who is representing a company to come to a queer person and say, we are working diligently on XYZ. We are not there yet, but we are working on it. And that, in my opinion, should be seen as a win that you're even working on it. If not, you're not already there, because few places are already there. But I wonder, Keisha, like, how do you get people to like even admit that this is something that they're thinking about, something that they're working on? I think that that's such a hurdle for so many people who are working in ad agencies.
I mean, I would echo what you say, and I would even take it a step further. I don't think any corporation is there. So anyone who doesn't have that self-awareness, I would say, is not fully self-aware. But I do think what Josh was saying is there are signals that we can give to people. And if you are LGBTQ and you're interviewing, I mean, even from your first screener call with our recruiters, I will tell you, not just LGBTQ plus, but all of our marginalized, kind of historically excluded communities, they tend to ask about, do we have ERGs, employee resource groups? Right? And then whether or not the recruiter knows kind of which group they come from or why they're asking, they're able to highlight our 9 groups, and they know that this person cares about certain things. So they're able to highlight, you know, things that might be on our culture page or our inclusive benefits or all of these things to, again, send the signal. I also am part of orientation. So there's the interview process. And, you know, usually if somebody, we have interviewed, you know, some non-binary folks, and when there's a pronoun request, you know, making sure the whole team knows, because to Josh's point, we want to make sure that we honor that through the whole system. But even the first day they arrive, I mean, I'm part of orientation, so they hear kind of what I do and what we have, but I also always promote the invitation to, hey, if you see something, say something, and if you've got feedback or you did something differently at the previous place of employment that we don't have here, or you're surprised that we don't have, like, I want to hear it, because going back to what I said earlier, like, we don't have it all figured out and we don't know what we don't know. And so I do think that there is a lot of power in understanding that, like, and empowering people to talk to you. And I think that's where a lot of the work happens, but there's signals you can give to show that you're working on things. And I think for me, that's gone a long way with candidates.
Thank you for that. That's really well said. I think wanna maybe pull on a string of what you were referencing earlier about other marginalized groups or historically excluded groups. And it's something I was thinking about. It's like, listen, I do the work. We're obviously queer focused. We're a queer organization, but we are also very, very aware that like a lot of things that we discuss are not solely queer issues. Because unfortunately, this is an issue that plagues many groups of people. And so I'm wondering if you, Lisa, Keisha, could talk a bit about like, and Lisa, I'll come to you first, how you feel like this issue of cultural fit and things of this nature are permeating out into other marginalized groups. And you can speak from your own experience, as you mentioned earlier, and how you may or may not think that other groups have managed to like escape this phrase, escape this ideology. Maybe that's a really beautiful, like, Edenic theory that I have that some groups maybe have. What do you think?
I wish that I could say that I think anybody has escaped it. I do not. And I think we kind of think in terms at New and Improved of not just historically excluded, but currently also it's like systemically excluded as kind of when you talk about language. Keisha and I agree there's evolution and language matters, and also we're not always going to get it right. But the reason I'm saying that now, right, is because to your point, Arya, like everything is DEI and DEI isn't everything, right? Like it doesn't matter, like our identities matter, but wherever we are in all of our intersections, like all of that can be hit with this, right? So I don't think that anyone is exempt, unfortunately. I feel like if someone is deemed different, and that can mean anything, right? Like from whatever the quote norm is, right? And again, I'd say as an industry, we have made some progress. I mean, I do want to acknowledge that we have. We are never going to be done because we're humans and this will never be done. And acknowledging that is really imperative, I think. But I think that also important to know that not every identity marker is visible. That's really important. I mean, I'll share personally, I have an invisible disability and a rare chronic illness. You don't see that when you see me, right? And race isn't even always visible, like, you know, so just to be aware of that too, and kind of as we look at humanity as a whole, and what that means. And I think when I first entered the business, which was like 25 years ago, the big inclusion, and the letters weren't around. People were not using these letters, right? It was like, oh, we hire women, and like they would get the ally cookie because you had like one woman who wasn't quite in leadership, but maybe was an ACD, right? Like it was that kind of thing. And I mean, I started in New York City. I mean, it was like there was a lot of great stuff, but that stuff was just rampant. And the whispers, right? The conversations were about gender only, and it was binary. And it was almost always white women, and the few women of color, which were usually Black, capital B Black, were in positions of assistance and things like that. I mean, like those weren't even the conversations that were being had. And so, while I'm never going to say we've come a long way, because, like I said, we have way, way more to go. But it has shifted, right? That conversation. So I just think that acknowledging that is really important. You know, is that how we think of everything is so binary. I also will say that I've had the privilege of working with a lot of people, of all different kinds of people, my whole career, and also obviously in my current position. And I work closely with a trans person who I have known for a while, and I definitely, I'm in DEI, right? Like I'm always learning and growing, but working as closely as I have with this person, I have learned now to catch myself, right? Like I was aware that there's binary, like I knew that going in, but the way that we're working, my eyes are so much more open than they were a couple years ago, because I'm having that experience in a different way. It's like I knew it, but I wasn't looking at it even as a DEI practitioner. So I think that's also really, really important to like expand our own minds and grace for each other, but understanding that we're always learning and growing. We've got to be open to that.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly well said. Go ahead, Keisha.
No, as I say, if you're not growing, you rot, as they say. I mean, yes, I think, and I love that build, Lisa, on instead of historically excluded communities, like actively or intentionally excluded communities to speak to the systemic. But I think, like by definition, that's the thing. We all, the lived experience is unique and may vary. I mean, even if you look at the LGBTQ plus community, there are distinctly different experiences for people that kind of fall under that umbrella. But what brings all of these groups together is the shared experience of discrimination, exclusion, and unequal access. And so I think, I do wish that there was some escape plan that somebody has figured out that would, but I think, on the positive side of that, it is this thing of that's where a lot of times people fail to see that a certain policy or a resource, while it may be created to support one group, like for example, I heard back in 2020 that there was like the pendulum swung and DE&I just became about, the Black community, on the heels of the George Floyd murder. And, arguably, I wouldn't disagree. There was definitely more of a focus. And just like Lisa said, at one point when DE&I, before it was called DE&I started, it was mostly gender, but it was white women, right? So there's always this evolution of who the focus group is. But I think what people fail to realize is systems, processes, things, resources put in place that could help the Black community. In a lot of ways, that same stuff could help and be applied to any group with this, that's actively discriminated against or didn't have access. And I think that's the beauty in it. And I think I always encourage people to, while there are these separations and these communities that we are all proud to be part of, it's also to remember that like the power and the strength is in coming together, and separating people was an easier way to make some of this stuff happen. And, there's this term that people have started using over the past couple of years, like oppression Olympics, right? Like my struggle is harder than your struggle, and you don't know my struggle. And I feel, and again, it's different and there are distinct, so I want to be clear with that, but the struggle is the same, and the solutions in a lot of ways are also very similar. And so I think I wish more people would adopt that mindset.
Not to like really dumb it down, but what are those solutions? Besides like I think the work that we're doing, full stop, period.
Yeah.
People, but like how do we undo this notion? Like how do you unlearn this thing? And how do you do that without, and this has always been my fear as a person who works in the queer space, is like, how do I like get someone to like understand the power of like the queer experience without like telling them that they're homophobic? Do you know what I mean? And like there are times and a place. Yeah, like Josh, I don't know what your thoughts on that too, but like, how do we do that well without starting something?
I, not to be a broken record, but I think it goes back to empathy and understanding, and really this nuanced understanding of being able to see somebody and see them eye to eye when they can't really see you in your full self. That's a really hard task, but it's one that I think is really important, because if you can see somebody in their full self, although they might not see your full lived experience, it is you validating their humanity and you sitting on the idea that humanity is what matters most. And not to say that you should give people free passes to do things and be, homophobic and arrogant. No, far from it. But I think when it goes to the idea of people having this fear around how to approach people of different lived experiences, how to affirm queer folks, that fear is not something that I would want them to recoil against and say, well, I'm just not going to deal with that. And it's also something that I think as a queer community, we have to welcome a little bit more, because I do think that there's an earnestness there. And when we go back to the idea that we all do have so much in common, and frankly, the power is the same. The power that's on our necks is all the same. It's the same person, it's the same boot, as MLK would say. So we're in a collective struggle. And I think when we see that, that's when we can understand that, like, okay, if I mess up saying somebody's pronouns a few times, it's about the will and the effort to try, and practice makes perfect. And so it's not, you're not doing a disservice to if you're misgendering somebody, if your whole purpose is trying to affirm them in due time and you're just slipping up. That's a mistake. That's not, don't be frightful of a mistake. And I think when we create an environment like that, that's when we can kind of open up and allow people to just see each other for their humanity.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add on to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think of two things. I think, and again, one of which I've said before, but words matter, right? So if you work at a company that's got a mission statement on their website, or you've heard your CEO or DE&I person say that, their mission is to create and include more voices, then I think raising the question of, okay, so is culture add a better term, or is there other more objective language and requirements that we should look at when hiring someone? Because I think even the reminder of hiring should be based on facts, things that can be proven. And I think a lot of times, and historically, especially when you're talking about something creative, it's subjective, right? But how can we put as much objectivity in it so that we're hiring and for people based on real things and not just instincts? But my second thing is, like, put diverse people in leadership positions. I mean, there is plenty of research to show that diversity attracts more diversity. And oftentimes an executive leadership team or a leadership team overall is a mirror of the diversity of the workforce overall. So I would just say, like, that's where your agency should prioritize hiring, because that can make an exponential difference. So
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that, all great points. Two things. One is to your first point, Keisha, about the subjectivity, right? And then also what I always encourage agencies to do, because I mean, again, having been in agencies, it's not until you're at a certain leadership point that you even get, if you even get training at all for hiring, and I love that GSD&M and some other agencies actually have this manual, where this is imperative, but all levels should be trained on this, because the idea is we will most likely move up the ladder at some point in our career. And even if we don't, we're influencing. Like, you could be a junior, again, I'm going to default to creative, I'm sorry. You could be a junior copywriter. And if you're not the one interviewing, but maybe you're the one who your friend sent the book over, like, you need to have that same awareness as the CCO does, right? Because, like, truth, just to be thinking about it, and also just good human training, right? Like, meaning so that we're going to show up better in all respects if we're thinking about that kind of from the jump, right? Like, so that should be kind of, like in the air and the water, right? Of our industry and of our agency. So that's one thing. And then The other thing that when you were talking about like the language, right? So, and I think this goes back, Josh, to what I think you said, like it's fear. People, we are afraid to make mistakes. And I think that's always been the case. I think that's even more so now, like as we've gone from 2020. And I think that there's a difference between, which is, I know what you both are, I'm kind of echoing what you said, like between allowing empathy and allowing mistakes that are not malintentional, but also the impact not matching the intent, right? And so I think that there's that. And so we kind of think of it as like it's progress, not perfection, but also holding people actually accountable. Like, and so one phrase that I just love, actually, I think it's like such a perfect way to think about this. It's you're responsible for your second thought and your first action. And you're responsible for your second thought and your first action. And the reason is your first thought is unconscious bias, lizard brain, stuff that you're not in control of. But if we can kind of try to conscious that, right, so to speak, then you can check, because it is hard, but you can check yourself for biases. And if you're doing this training and if you're having these conversations and, you know, and really leaning into that from an empathetic standpoint, you can start to teach yourself that. And again, hold each other accountable, but in a kind calling in way. Counsel culture versus cancel culture, unless there are times cancel is necessary, but most likely that's not what we're talking about most of the time, right? So it's like that idea of community. And Josh, kind of back to your point of misgendering, because I get that question a lot, I think, because I am an ally to the community, but not, you know, of the community. I think people feel safe coming to me because they're like, oh God, I messed up, right? And my thing is, you know, correct yourself and move on, apologize and move on, right? Like, I'm sorry, fix it, move on. And if you don't realize that you did it, hopefully somebody else in the room can do that. And again, in a kind way, so you're not putting the onus on the person that you misgendered, because that's where I think, again, people get really afraid. So
Yeah. And I mean, I have a question, I guess, not to take your not to take your job, Arya, but I was just gonna say, how do you normalize discomfort? Because I think that that's something that is really critical. And in organizations where I've seen DEI sort of be more of a virtue signal than something that's taken off and really anchored itself in the org, it's really been about this sort of guard against discomfort. And I think that that's a human reaction. So how do we sort of prime ourselves to deal with the discomfort of a situation such as that, Lisa, or myriad others when you deal with the dynamics of just a workplace and different lived experiences?
I mean, it's definitely hard to do. I think, you know, Keisha, you're creating a culture of inclusion. I'm going to use GSD&M, right? Because I also know some of what you're doing besides what you shared tonight. And again, we're still human, right, Josh? Like and we're not all the same, and we don't all have the same levels of comfort. But I love how you just put that, normalizing discomfort. I mean, that should be on a t-shirt. That's like, I mean, that's like, because that is what it is. And I think making it a safe, an actual safe space, right, where people can have those conversations. And again, the fine line is not putting the onus on the people who are, you know, the receiver of that, right? And I think that it's really, you know, I think it has to come from leadership. It's going to be top down and bottom up, and kind of meeting in the middle, so to speak, of like how we lean into the fact that like what went wrong. And I think it's also back to Keisha, what you said, it's like you're not blaming and shaming, right? Like it's an open calling in conversation, but that really does have to come from the top, you know?
I mean, I would add, like, the more you do it, Josh, the easier it becomes. And so I think normalizing, I don't like to use the word discomfort, right? Because I think that automatically, again, going back to language matters, people just automatically will have a reaction of like, you want me to be uncomfortable? Like, even when people are like, get comfortable being uncomfortable. I was never saying that, because who wants to be uncomfortable? Like, I don't choose to go to the dentist, you know what I mean? But I do think when you just model that behavior and the breakthroughs and the conversations that you're able to have, and to Lisa's point, top down, bottom up, peer to peer. And so, you know, there's a series we have, and not to keep, I swear this is not a GSD&M commercial, but I do like to give tangible examples, because I think that can be helpful. And those are things that people can take back to their places of work. So that's why I share these things. But we have a series here called Elephant in the Room. And it's basically, like the title suggests, about really talking about things that maybe you aren't typically, you know, bringing up because they are uncomfortable. And it is our most well-attended series that we have. And you would think, again, an uncomfortable conversation by title wouldn't be, but people are always so amazed by what they learn. And it's also an internal panel that talks about something. So from everything from ageism to, anti-Semitism to Black stereotypes and tropes in advertising. But people take things away from it. So I think like just normalizing conversation that maybe are conversations people don't normally have is a great way to do that.
I want to attend that. And also, Keisha, like you're here because the work you're doing is impeccable and incredible. So I'm happy that we get to hear about all the work that you're doing because I think that's part of why we as Do the Work wanted you on this panel. So just needed to give you the shout out for that. One thing I wanted to talk about before we go, if it's all right, is something that like I hadn't really thought about was going to be so deep in this conversation, which is fear. We've talked a lot about fear, and I'm not fearful at work. I'm very, very, very blessed. I'm like also the type of person who refuses to be scared at work anymore. I used to be so deeply scared, and I'm just not. But I see everyone else is scared all the time, all the time. And I want to really posit this as a question of like, what does it say about what is happening in our industry right now? What is the state of our industry, and like what are we going to do to fix that fear? Because so much of what we've talked about today in terms of the systemic issues do seem to like crawl back to this fear. And so I'm wondering like, what do you all see as the current state of how things are going, and how do you think that they're going to move forward? Whoever wants it can have it.
So sorry, to clarify, you're specifically talking about how to overcome that fear? Is that what you're?
So I think in this course of this conversation, I've realized that it seems really intrinsic to this issue. And so I'm wondering how we feel about that fear and how we might be able to overcome it.
I think unpacking what it comes from, which is kind of what we're talking about, right? It's like it comes from cancel culture, right? It comes from, and again, there's a time and a place for that, absolutely. But, brands getting canceled, people getting let go. I mean, like, we are in a state of fear. And I think some of it, frankly, is not a bad thing. I mean, some of it rightfully so. And I think that's how change happens, right? If you're afraid and not frozen, because that is definitely a fear response, right? The fight or flight or fawn. But if we're afraid enough to make change, right, for the good, and meaning use that energy for something good and to fix things versus to shy away or keep repeating, which again is easier said than done because humans are messy and changing behavior is hard. But I do think sometimes fear is that fire under our butts that forces change.
Yeah. And I guess I would add to that a couple things of, there's fear in your workplace, but there's also, we have been living in such a world of uncertainty, right? And so I think that is what aids in the fear. We're in an election year. People saw brands getting canceled for doing things that they had been doing for years and supporting groups that they had been supporting for years. And so I think what it says for me about both DE&I and the need in our industry is like, despite all the headlines and all the tweets that, Elon Musk wants to put out, like DE&I can't die. Like it's necessary. You can call it whatever you want, but it can't, because until, our workforces represent the people and the audiences that we're talking to, we are going to fall short. But I think, the optimistic mindset that again, I want to share, and I hope that people really think about is like, there is no better industry to solve these kinds of problems. Like we have skills and talent to change, behaviors and make people want to do something and change attitudes and beliefs. So I think sometimes with that fear comes this feeling of, inadequacy, or there's nothing I can do about it. We just have to deal with it. And I think that's where people get frozen and that's where people get stuck, Lisa. And so I think I just want to encourage everyone who's listening to know that like you're capable of being part of the change. And even with this conversation that we're having now about fit, you may not be a hiring manager listening to this, but understand that every employee at, an agency or a corporation does have an influence on who comes in that door, who stays, and how long they stay. So again, just encourage that do something mindset that I started with.
I agree. We all have a role to play, right? It's everyone's responsibility and everyone has a role, and regardless of your role, right? And I think the other thing to kind of piggyback on what you just said, we reflect and affect culture, right? So it's who's in the room doing the work is reflected in what is in who is in the work, right? And like that's really important. And that means all the things, like that isn't just again visible, although that's important. It's all the things and like all the nuances of the stories that we're telling, like are not going to be told if we don't have a team that actually reflects the world that we live in. So, you know, just really to be like cognizant of like just kind of again that the reality where the fear lifts a little bit. It's like these are just the facts and we can do something.
Sure. And then I'll just chime in really quickly. I think that the other big thing is enabling people to be able to be forthright, to be able to come as their true selves, to be able to lean into their difference. Because one thing that I think is really critical is making sure that, you know, when you have an inclusive lot of people working for you, that their voices are heard, that they're at the table, that they're making decisions and ultimately informing paths forward. And sometimes that's not the case. So I think, you know, beyond making sure that you're hiring in a certain way, it's about, you know, making sure that that environment's there for them to raise complaints and to also share their lived experience and imbue it into the work that's being done.
Y'all, we could talk for hours. These are you all you got more? Let's hear it.
One more
Yes.
thing to that, Josh, is such great points, is to also share success stories, right? Because I think that's the other thing that is important. Like, this is a funny example, but like if you're going to complain at a restaurant, like also praise, right? It's like if you think about it like that, so do that at work, right? It's like when you see things that are going well, I think that's really important because that builds on the learning, right? And so we definitely need to be pointing out the negatives, like otherwise we can't grow, but we also need to look at what we're doing right. And like Keisha, you said earlier, kind of apply that in other places where it makes sense.
It's a great note to end on. I am so thankful for all of you for joining this conversation, having the conversation, and mostly the work that you are doing outside of this conversation with your actual work lives. Before we go, I want to allow each of you just to tell the folks where they can find you, where they can connect with you. I'm assuming everyone's going to be obsessed with you at this point, so want to hear how to be better connected. Josh, I want to come to you first. Where can the folks get into contact with you?
LinkedIn, very boring. And if you want to spice it up, Official Weaver on Instagram, but LinkedIn is where you can find me.
Thank you. Keisha, where can the folks find you and learn
We
more
were
about
challenged, we should say, we were challenged to do something other than LinkedIn, but I am also on LinkedIn, so GSD&M. But I think another avenue, and I talked about it enough that, and it truly is an online resource available to the entire industry. So, and it's a URL and GSDM, no ampersand.com, and GSD&M and GSDM.com. That's our online resource and guide to better work through diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it includes that interview guide that I kind of kept speaking to, along with a host of other resources that I think are really helpful to anyone in the industry. And there's a contact us button at the bottom of that website, and that comes straight to my inbox. So if you reach out to inclusion at GSD&M, that will come to me too. But thank you so much for having me.
Of course, thank you for being here. Amazing. Lisa, last but not least, where can the folks get into contact with you?
So thank you. Same, LinkedIn is the easy place. Also, same my website, which is wearenewandimproved.com. So www.wearenewandimproved.com. You can get me directly that way. And also we have a whole page of free resources as well, which are designed. We've got a DEI calendar, which has all kinds of inclusive, diverse and inclusive holidays and observances with links for learning that we have vetted. That's a labor of love, free on all platforms. We've got ageism guides. We've got all kinds of stuff there as well, because again, not to gatekeep. And I love that GSD&M as an agency is doing that as well. Like to not gatekeep this information is huge. So like, please go to the website, take what you need, download it, contact me if you need anything. I'm really glad we've had this conversation. Thank you for including me.
Of course, always invited to the conversation. If you're interested in learning more about Do the Work, if somehow you don't know more about us at this point, dothework.com, Do the Work across all socials. Work is spelled WERQ. We are queer. Please stay tuned. We will have more programming in the next few months. Very excited to continue having these types of conversations with panelists who are just as great as these folks are and the energy that you've brought today has been amazing. So thank you all. I appreciate all of you, and we will see you here next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.